The advance of Buell's army from Nelson's division had begun arriving around 5 o'clock. Its 36th Indiana Infantry Regiment was placed on the east side of Grant's last line in time to help defend against an attack. The two Navy gunboats helped defend, and the Lexington fired 32 rounds into the attacking Confederate force in only 10 minutes. The Confederate attack was repulsed, and shortly after 6 o'clock, Beauregard called off all attacks. Buell and his army and some of Grant's army believed that they had saved Grant's Army of the Tennessee. Grant had a different opinion, believing that by 6 o'clock the Confederate army was worn out. When Beauregard called off all attacks, it was near sunset, and he assumed Grant's army could be eliminated on the next day. He had received a telegram saying Buell's army was in Alabama, and did not know Grant was already being reinforced. The Confederate army was badly disorganized, and it had just finished taking prisoners from the Hornets' Nest around 5:30. Attacks after dark were rare because of problems with friendly fire, and darkness would occur soon. The exhausted Confederate army already had about 8,000 casualties. For many years after the battle, critics believed Beauregard had squandered an opportunity to finish Grant's army. Modern historians such as Cunningham and Daniel disagree with that assessment. Cunningham wrote that Beauregard's critics ignore the existing situation on the Shiloh battlefield, including Confederate disorganization, time before sunset, and Grant's strong position augmented by gunboats. Daniel wrote that the Confederates could have permanently breached or pulverized the Federal line in an additional hour or so of piecemeal night assaults simply lacks plausibility. He mentions that it took the Confederates 6 hours to conquer the Hornets' Nest, and Grant's last line was a stronger position. He also cites exhaustion, low ammunition, and one staff officer's belief that 1/3 of the Confederate army was plundering instead of fighting. Beauregard spent the evening near Shiloh Church in what has been Sherman's tent. Most of the Confederate army moved back to the original Union camps. Beauregard sent a telegram to Richmond discussing a complete victory, driving the enemy from every position. Many of the Confederate troops believed that the battle was essentially over, and spent time plundering the camps. Some soldiers took their loot and began walking back to Corinth. Some of the Confederate troops were now armed with better weapons than the ones they had at the beginning of the day. Austrian, Enfield, and Springfield rifles were taken from the dead, wounded, captured, or fleeing Union soldiers. It began raining at 10, and at midnight the rain became a storm with thunder and lightning. This, combined with the constant shelling by the Union gunboats throughout the night, made it difficult for the exhausted Confederates to get any sleep. Because of the exhaustion and the belief that Grant's army was almost finished, the Confederate forces were not reorganized. No plans or orders were made for the next day, and it was through the various commands that would regroup at that time for a final mop-up action. The original Confederate plan was to push Grant's army from Pittsburgh Landing and pin it against the northern creeks, where it could not move quickly or get resupplied. Instead, Grant had been forced back to the defensible position at Pittsburgh Landing, where he could be reinforced and resupplied. Grant's army had 7,000 men killed and wounded, 3,000 more captured, and 10,000 men who were afraid to fight. Before being reinforced, he had an estimated 18,000 fighters formed on his last line. Since most of the Union camps had been captured, these hungry and tired men would have to sleep in the open without blankets, and rain and cold weather added to their misery. At 7:15, 5,800 fresh troops from Lew Wallace's division arrived at the battlefield and were positioned next to Sherman. Brigadier General Thomas Crittenden's division from Buell's army began arriving at 9 o'clock, and 2 hours later the entire division was at the landing. Eventually Buell would have nearly 18,000 men available for the battle. The Union line from west to east consisted of the divisions commanded by Lew Wallace, Sherman, McClellan, Hurlbut, Crittenden, and Nelson. Prentice's division was effectively destroyed, and Tuttle was behind the line trying to reorganize W.H.L. Wallace's division. Earlier in the day, Colonel James B. McPherson, Grant's chief engineer, asked Grant if preparations should be started for a retreat. Grant's response was, "Retreat? No. I propose an attack at daylight and whip them." Buell met with Sherman at sunset and learned that Grant planned to attack at sunrise. An understanding was made that Grant would have the west side of the line, while Buell would plan his own attack on the east side. Despite Grant's seniority, Buell considered himself independent, and Grant chose not to consult with him that evening. Sherman found Grant resting under a tree around midnight and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant replied, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Between midnight and 4 a.m., Brigadier General Alexander M. McCook's division from Buell's Army of the Ohio arrived in Savannah. The first unit from this division to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing came ashore around 4 a.m. Elsewhere, the Confederate 47th Tennessee Infantry Regiment was marching to the battlefield. This poorly armed regiment of 600 raw recruits was the only reinforcement Beauregard received, and it did not arrive until 8 a.m. After deducting casualties and those who had abandoned their posts, Beauregard's Confederate army now numbered fewer than 20,000 fighters. On the east side of the Union line, Buell's attack began at 5 a.m. with Nelson's three brigades. A few hours later, Nelson was joined on his right by Crittenden. The two divisions advanced, dispersed enemy skirmishers, and were gradually joined on Crittenden's right by brigades from McCook's division. McCook did not have all three of his brigades available until close to noon. On the Confederate side, Hardee commanded the right that faced Nelson, with the division commanded by Brigadier General John Jones M. Withers as his most organized force. The skirmishers that Nelson had chased off earlier were Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry regiment and small portions of Chalmers' brigade from Withers' division. Behind the skirmishers were Chalmers' brigade and a makeshift brigade of 3 regiments. A mix of regiments formed the line further west, and several batteries gave artillery support. At the Davis wheat field, a small field between Barnes Field and the Peach Orchards, the brigade commanded by Colonel William B. Hazen took more than half the losses Nelson's division received for the whole day. More fighting took place near Sarah Bell Field, and after 3 hours of fighting it became a stalemate. Both sides withdrew around noon, putting Nelson back at Wicker Field. During this fighting, Hardee was slightly wounded, although he led a counterattack, whilst of Nelson, Crittenden and McCook advanced before being forced back to Duncan Field. At noon, Buell's army had control of the Hornet's Nest. Grant's attack began with Lew Wallace's fresh division driving Pond's exhausted brigade away from Jones's field. After a Confederate counterattack by Gibson and Wood, Sherman brought his division to the line and the Confederates were pushed back. McClellan and Hurlbut joined the fight, and all 4 Union divisions advanced at 10:30. At that time, Claiborne brigade of 800 men took significant casualties, when they unsuccessfully assaulted the Union force. Buell attacked again shortly after noon. In about 2 hours, Nelson and Crittenden reached the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Further west, McCook advanced westward on the Corinth-Pittsburgh Landing Road, which caused a gap with Crittenden. The gap was filled by brigades from Grant's army that had been held in reserve. The Confederate army had held off Buell's fresh troops for a total of 6 hours, but their resistance was close to ending. On Grant's side of the battlefield, Sherman and McClellan were stopped at noon when Cheatham's Confederate division attacked east of the crossroads and north of the Water Oaks Pond. The two Union divisions were driven north about 300 yards. Despite light opposition at this front, Lew Wallace had put his division in a defensive position and did not resume the offensive until Sherman and McClellan had been pushed back by Cheatham's attackers. Bragg formed another line by Water Oaks Pond, and a 2-hour fight ensued with Beauregard personally leading various Confederate units. McCook's westward advance, instead of south, which began at 1:30, meant that Bragg had Lew Wallace, Sherman, and McClellan on his front, and McCook on his right flank. After Bragg fell back south of the Hamburg-Purdy Road, Beauregard counterattacked using a force that was mostly Wood's brigade. Near Waters Oak Pond, his force pushed McCook back until McCook regrouped and repulsed the attackers. Soon Beauregard and Bragg were forced back, and Union troops crossed the Hamburg-Purdy Road at 2:30. All morning Beauregard hoped that the arrival of 20,000 men under the command of Brigadier General Earl Van Dorn would change the battle momentum back to favouring the Confederates. He was eventually notified that Van Dorn was still far away, so preparations for a withdrawal to Corinth began about 1 p.m. At about 2 p.m. Breckinridge began forming his corps into a rear guard position near Shiloh Church. Confederate batteries around Shiloh Church began a bombardment campaign to deceive the Union soldiers into thinking the Confederate army was still present. At 3:30, the last of the Confederate artillery was hauled away towards Corinth. Grant and Buell did not pursue the Confederate army and have been criticized for their decisions. One historian called this the final Federal blunder and believed that Lew Wallace's fresh division should have been sent in pursuit. It started to rain at 6:30, and the rain turned to hail as the temperature dropped. The battle was over with a huge number of casualties on both sides. At 10 a.m. on April 8th, Union forces commanded by Sherman and Wood began a pursuit of the Confederate forces. Breckinridge's covering force included about 350 cavalrymen commanded by Colonel Forrest. This group was a mixture of Forrest's men, John Hunt Morgan's Kentucky Cavalry, Texas Rangers, and the 1st Mississippi Cavalry. They were armed with revolvers and shotguns and were instructed to fire only when they were within 20 steps of the enemy. On the left, 2 brigades from Wood's Union Division skirmished with Wirt Adams' cavalry regiment and then returned to camp. On the right, a group led by Forrest attacked Sherman's men as they were clearing fallen timber near a small creek, causing some of them to run for their lives. Unofficial Union casualties were 15 killed, 25 wounded, and 53 taken prisoner. Among the few Confederate wounded was Forrest, who escaped after being shot at close range. Sherman ended the pursuit, and Breckinridge continued south. Multiple sources list Union casualties as 13,047, with 1,754 killed, 8,408 wounded, and 2,885 missing or captured. Grant's army had 10,944 casualties, while Buell's had 2,103. Without counting those captured or missing, the brigades commanded by Sweeney, Veatch, and Colonel Nelson G. Williams all had over 600 killed or wounded. The report in the official records lists 2 brigade commanders as killed or mortally wounded, 5 wounded, including Sweeney, and 1 captured. One historian believes the high number of officer losses caused casualty figures to be understated, and that they really total closer to 14,500 men. Confederate casualties totaled to 10,699, with 1,728 killed, 8,012 wounded, and 959 missing or captured. Additional sources agree with those figures. The Confederate totals do not report or do not include reporting for cavalry or the 47th in Tennessee Infantry Regiment that arrived for the second day of the battle. Similar to the understatements of the Union casualties, one historian believes Confederate casualties were probably closer to the 12,000 mark. Using the commonly quoted statistics, Claiborne's brigade had 790 wounded and 188 killed, both numbers higher than those for any brigade in any of the armies at the battle. In addition to the wounding of Johnston and Hardee, Beauregard's report mentions 6 casualties for major generals and brigadier generals, 1 killed, 3 severely wounded, 1 slightly wounded, and 1 injured when his horse was shot. Another Confederate soldier killed was Samuel B. Todd, brother of President Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. At the time, the battle was the largest fought in America and had the highest number of casualties so far in the war. The high number of casualties helped convince many Union leaders that the war was not going to end quickly in the West. About 20,000 men were killed or wounded at Shiloh, while early major battles at Manassas, Wilson's Creek, Fort Donelson, and Pea Ridge combined to only 12,000. Shiloh's total casualties of 23,746, which may be understated, puts it in the top 10, 6th or 7th, in the American Civil War. Initially, news on the battle was positive for Grant. That changed a week later, especially when a somewhat exaggerated newspaper report by Whitelaw Reid was released. Largely based on testimony from Union deserters and stragglers, the article said that Grant was surprised and falsely claimed that Union soldiers were bayoneted in their tents. Only Buell, who according to Reid had saved Grant, was treated as a hero. Self-serving accounts from some of Buell's officers also swayed public opinion, and false rumors circulated that Grant had been drunk. Among the most justified criticisms of Grant was the lack of fortifications at the camps around Pittsburgh Landing. One historian considers this a critical mistake. At least 2 of Grant's generals counselled against entrenching, and Grant believed that enemy troops would not leave their own entrenched positions. Lew Wallace received criticism for his inability to get his division to the battlefield in a timely manner, and he was eventually removed from Grant's army. His division should have been ready to move from Crump's Landing, which is 6 miles from Pittsburgh Landing via the River Road. Instead, he marched his division the wrong way, and the countermarch was delayed because he directed his original vanguard to move to the rear so it could become the vanguard when the division reversed its march. He may also have lost time by marching down a rugged path through cornfields and pastures. Critics also accused him of dilatoriness or slow procrastination. This portion of his criticism was unjustified, since his men moved 50 miles in 6.5 hours, similar to the rate for Nelson's division. Grant wrote in 1863 that a different commander could have moved Wallace's division to the battlefield before 1 o'clock. Wallace spent the next few decades defending his actions. In 1885, Grant received a letter from the widow of Brigadier General William H. L. Wallace that had been written by Lew Wallace to her husband on April 5, 1862. The letter provided enough information about Lew Wallace's preparations and route choice that Grant felt Wallace was unjustly criticised. The route selection was justified given that Wallace did not know Sherman had been pushed back and orders. It did not specify which road to take. These conclusions appeared in Century magazine in July 1885, and as a note in personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, Wallace's post-war life was more successful as an author, and became well known for writing the best-selling novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Some of the more savage denunciations of Grant came from politicians representing Ohio and Iowa, home states of many of the men who ran away when fighting started. One politician complained to Lincoln, saying Grant was an incompetent drunk. That was the political liability. Lincoln's response was, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Sherman could have been one of the battle's scapegoats and did not get along with the press. He also received more praise than criticism. Halleck praised his performance and requested a promotion for him, noting that Sherman had 3 horses killed under him and was wounded twice. Halleck arrived at Pittsburgh Landing on April the 11th and took personal command, as he had planned earlier. On April 30th, he named Grant as his second-in-command. This was a meaningless position, but Halleck's solution to the Grant criticism was a de facto suspension that satisfied the critics. On April the 8th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis reported to the Confederate Congress that, according to the latest accounts, Johnston had gained a complete victory. A last-minute addition to his speech mentioned Johnston's death. Before the battle, the public had wanted Johnston removed because of the loss of most of the Tennessee. Now he was a hero. Over the next few days, more information about the battle became available. The initial perception was that only untoward events had saved the Union Army from destruction, and the withdrawal to Corinth was part of a strategic plan. Eventually, critics began to blame Beauregard for the defeat, citing the lack of twilight attack on the first day of the battle. Confederate President Davis believed that the loss of Albert Sidney Johnston was the turning point of our fate. With the loss of Shiloh, the likelihood of the Confederacy regaining control of the upper Mississippi River or Mississippi Valley was severely diminished, and the large number of casualties represented the start of an unwinnable war of attrition. The victory at Shiloh also placed the Union Army in a strategic position to infiltrate and capture key points in the South. Waiting until he was fully reinforced and resupplied, Halleck began a painfully slow movement to the Corinth on April 29th. Arriving on the morning of May 30th, Union troops found the city abandoned. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Memphis were overrun by Union Navy forces over the next 3 months. By July, Halleck was promoted to Chief of Staff in Washington, and Grant became a commander of the new larger district of West Tennessee. Grant would go on to lead the siege of Vicksburg, where nearly 30,000 Confederate troops surrendered on July 4th, 1863. If you found the information in these videos informative, please feel free to give the videos a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, I thank you for listening and watching this video.